Do not worry, Richard Sterling said in flawless Mandarin, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. The maid does not understand a word we are saying. Laughter rolled across the private dining room. Soft. Expensive. Cruel. Maya Brooks kept her eyes lowered as she refilled a teacup beside the 12-foot walnut table. The golden chandelier above scattered warm light across polished silverware, and designer watches worth more than her yearly salary. She said nothing. She was supposed to be invisible. Richard glanced at her for barely a second before returning his attention to the Chinese investors seated around him. People like her hear sounds, he continued in Mandarin. Not meaning. More laughter. One executive nearly choked on his drink. Maya's fingers tightened around the porcelain teapot. Just slightly. Not enough for anyone to notice. But she understood every syllable. Every insult. Every word. The air smelled of cedarwood, expensive cologne, and roasted duck from the kitchen downstairs. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath a cold spring rain. Inside, the room felt hotter by the minute. Richard Sterling loved moments like this. He was a billionaire technology magnate who built an empire buying struggling companies and turning them into gold. Newspapers called him ruthless. Investors called him brilliant. Employees called him something else when he was not around. At the far end of the table sat Li Wei, chairman of Dragon Crest Holdings. Unlike the others, he was not laughing. He simply watched Maya for a brief moment before returning to the discussion. Something unreadable passed through his eyes. Maya noticed. Then the conversation shifted. Numbers. Contracts. Deadlines. Billions of dollars moved through the room like invisible electricity. Maya continued serving tea while memorizing every detail without trying. It was a habit she never lost. Tomorrow, Richard said confidently, sliding a thick folder toward Li Wei. We finalize everything. Li Wei nodded slowly. Assuming all terms remain unchanged. Richard smiled. Of course. A strange silence followed. Brief. Barely noticeable. Then Li Wei answered in Mandarin. Quietly. Too quietly for most people. The amendment remains hidden? One man near him adjusted his tie. Another looked toward the door. Richard leaned forward. No one has found it. Maya's pulse stumbled. Amendment? Hidden? She carefully set down another cup. The porcelain touched the saucer with a soft click. Nobody looked at her. And once he signs? Another investor asked. Li Wei's expression never changed. Control transfers automatically. Richard chuckled. Then tomorrow is going to be a very profitable day. This time no one laughed. Maya felt a cold sensation travel down her spine. Control transfers automatically. She repeated the phrase in her mind. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The meeting continued. Voices rose and fell. Documents changed hands. Yet Maya could not stop thinking about those 4 words. She had heard language like that before. Years ago. In another life. In another country. A life nobody in this building knew existed. Not the house staff. Not the executives. Certainly not Richard Sterling. An hour later the meeting finally ended. Chairs scraped across hardwood floors. Jackets were buttoned. Handshakes exchanged. Richard passed Maya without acknowledging her existence. Clean this room before morning, he said. We have another meeting at 8. Yes, sir, Maya replied softly. The room emptied. Silence settled over the penthouse. Rain tapped against the glass. Maya gathered empty cups and folded napkins into a tray. Then she saw it. A single document left behind beneath Richard's chair. One page partially exposed from the contract folder. Her eyes drifted to a highlighted clause near the bottom. The moment she read the first sentence, all the color drained from her face. Because she recognized that exact language. And she knew exactly what it was designed to do. Maya froze beside the table, the contract page trembling between her fingers. The city lights beyond the glass blurred into streaks of gold and white as rain rolled down the windows. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. She had seen this structure before. Years ago. In Shanghai. Buried inside acquisition deals designed to look harmless until the signatures dried. One clause. One sentence. One mistake. And everything changed. She lowered the page slowly and scanned the amendment again. The wording was elegant. Almost invisible. To anyone else, it looked routine. To Maya, it was a loaded weapon hidden beneath legal language. Control of Sterling Technologies would not stay with Richard. The moment the merger closed, voting power would quietly transfer to Dragon Crest Holdings. Richard would not own his empire anymore. He just did not know it yet. The elevator chimed somewhere down the hall. Maya quickly slid the page back into the folder. Her pulse raced. She should walk away. Richard had mocked her. Humiliated her. Treated her like furniture. Let him sign it. Let him learn the hard way. But the thought would not leave her alone. She grabbed the tray and headed toward the service elevator. The stainless steel doors reflected her tired eyes. By the time she reached the staff corridor downstairs, her stomach felt heavy. Industrial lights buzzed overhead. Kitchen workers pushed carts through narrow hallways. A dishwasher rattled loudly behind swinging doors. Life moved normally around her while a $4 billion disaster counted down above their heads. Maya. She turned. It was Carmen from housekeeping. You look like you saw a ghost. Maya forced a smile. Just tired. Carmen frowned but let it go. Maya continued toward her locker. Inside, beneath folded uniforms and old receipts, sat a worn notebook. She opened it carefully. Pages filled with Mandarin notes. Financial terminology. Risk analysis models. Memories from a life nobody here knew existed. Her fingers paused over an old business card tucked inside. Shanghai International Risk Group. Senior Compliance Analyst. Maya Brooks. She stared at it for several seconds. Then quickly shut the notebook. That life was over. Or at least she thought it was. The next morning, sunlight broke through the storm clouds. Richard's penthouse conference room buzzed with anticipation. Lawyers adjusted laptops. Executives reviewed presentations. Coffee steamed from silver carafes. $4 billion sat waiting on the polished table. Richard looked relaxed. Confident. Victorious. Maya entered quietly with breakfast service. Nobody acknowledged her. Richard certainly did not. Everything ready? He asked his legal team. Ready to sign, one attorney replied. Maya's grip tightened around the coffee pot. Across the room, Li Wei entered with his delegation. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Smiles appeared. Handshakes followed. Cameras flashed. The deal was minutes away. Maya watched the contract being placed directly in front of Richard. Her chest tightened. This was it. Sign and lose everything. Richard uncapped his pen. Gentlemen, he said proudly, let us make history. The room nodded in approval. Maya felt trapped between two impossible choices. Stay silent and protect herself. Or speak and risk everything. Her eyes drifted toward Richard. She remembered every insult from the night before. Every laugh. Every word spoken in Mandarin. Yet somehow, that made the choice harder. Because if she warned him now, she would be saving the very man who believed she was beneath him. Richard lowered the pen toward the signature line. Maya's pulse hammered. 10 seconds. 9. 8. Then something unexpected happened. Across the table, Li Wei looked directly at Maya. Not at the lawyers. Not at Richard. At her. His expression changed. Just slightly. Recognition. Real recognition. Suddenly he stood up. The room fell silent. Richard blinked. Is something wrong? Li Wei ignored him. His eyes remained locked on Maya. Then, in perfect Mandarin, he asked a question that made the blood drain from her face. Maya Brooks, what are you doing serving coffee? Maya felt every eye in the room snap toward her. The silence hit harder than any shout. Even the soft hum of the ventilation system seemed louder now. Sunlight reflected off the chrome water pitchers, scattering sharp flashes across the conference table. Richard Sterling slowly lowered his pen. "You know her?" he asked. Li Wei never looked away from Maya. "Know her?" he repeated in Mandarin. 5 years ago, half the compliance department in Shanghai was terrified of her. A nervous laugh escaped one of the executives. Nobody joined in. Maya stood motionless beside the coffee cart, her fingers wrapped around the handle of the silver pot. Richard frowned. "There must be some mistake." Li Wei's expression hardened. "No mistake." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a tablet. A few taps later, a photograph appeared on the screen. The device rotated toward the room. Maya felt her stomach tighten. There she was. Different haircut. Different suit. Standing on a stage in Shanghai beside senior regulators and corporate attorneys. Her name appeared beneath the image. Senior Risk Analyst. The room erupted into whispers. Richard stared at the screen, then at Maya, then back again. "That is impossible." Maya wished it were. "Why did you not say anything?" Li Wei asked quietly. She swallowed. "Nobody asked?" Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Richard's jaw tightened. Embarrassment flashed across his face before disappearing behind anger. "Even if that is true," he said sharply, "it has nothing to do with this deal." Maya immediately recognized the shift. He was trying to regain control. Trying to put her back in her place. "Richard," one attorney began. "No." Richard stood. The leather chair slid backward across the hardwood floor. "We are minutes away from closing a historic merger. I am not going to stop because my maid used to have a different job." The word maid landed heavily in the room. Maya noticed a few faces wince. Li Wei noticed too. "Interesting," he said softly. Richard ignored him. "You clean my house," Richard continued, now looking directly at Maya. "You serve coffee. That is your role here." The tension tightened like steel wire. Maya could feel heat rising along her neck. Every instinct told her to stay silent. Walk away. Let him sign. Let the consequences teach him what arrogance never could. Then one of the lawyers nervously cleared his throat. "Sir, there is one thing." Richard looked irritated. "What?" The attorney hesitated. "Last night someone accessed the digital draft and flagged a section for review." The room froze again. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Who?" The attorney checked his tablet. "The user identification was never completed. But whoever did it highlighted Amendment 14C. Maya felt her pulse spike. Amendment 14C. The exact clause. Richard looked around the room. "Who flagged it?" Nobody answered. Then Li Wei slowly smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind that made people uncomfortable. "Perhaps," he said, "you should ask the person who recognized it." Richard turned toward Maya. For the first time since she had entered his employment, he was not looking through her. He was looking directly at her. The pressure in the room became unbearable. Phones appeared beneath the table. Someone discreetly started recording. Even the lawyers seemed afraid to breathe. Richard took a step closer. "Do you know something about this contract?" Maya stared at the signature page still waiting beneath his hand. One signature. That was all it would take. She could end this now. Or she could stay silent forever. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Finally, she looked up. "Yes." The single word hit the room like thunder. Richard's expression darkened. "Then explain." Maya inhaled slowly. The city skyline shimmered behind her through the glass wall. Every eye was fixed on her. Every camera pointed at her. Every second felt heavier than the last. She opened the contract, turned directly to Amendment 14C, and placed one finger on a single sentence buried deep inside the legal language. Then her eyes lifted toward Li Wei. Because in that instant, she realized something even more dangerous than the hidden clause. And the look Li Wei gave her confirmed it. The silence lasted barely a second, but it felt endless. Maya's finger remained pressed against the sentence buried deep inside Amendment 14C. Around her, phone cameras continued recording. Tiny red lights blinked. Air conditioning vents hummed overhead. Somewhere near the back wall, a glass of water trembled against polished wood as an executive's hand shook. Richard Sterling stared at the clause, then at Maya. "What did you see?" His voice sounded different now. Less confident. More dangerous. Maya did not answer immediately. Her eyes stayed on Li Wei. "This clause is not the real problem." A ripple moved through the room. Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" Maya slowly turned another page. The paper slid across the table with a soft whisper. "Everybody is looking at the transfer of voting rights." Her voice remained calm. "That is what they are supposed to see." The room grew even quieter. One attorney adjusted his glasses. Another leaned forward. Maya tapped a second paragraph hidden beneath a dense block of legal language. "This is the real trap." Richard snatched the contract and scanned the page. His confidence vanished line by line. Color drained from his face. "No!" The word escaped before he could stop it. One of the lawyers reached for the document. Then another. Suddenly 3 attorneys were reading at once. Nobody spoke. Nobody blinked. The atmosphere changed. "What is it?" Richard demanded. The senior attorney looked up slowly. Sweat glistened along his forehead. "If this activates..." He swallowed. "Sterling Technologies does not just lose voting control." Richard's jaw tightened. "Finish the sentence." The lawyer hesitated. "You lose ownership of every international patent developed in the last 11 years. The room exploded into whispers. Several executives stood up so quickly their chairs rolled backward. A phone slipped from someone's hand and clattered onto the hardwood floor. Richard looked like he had been punched by invisible force. 11 years. Thousands of patents. Tens of billions of dollars. Gone. His empire was not being diluted. It was being dismantled. Maya watched realization spread across the room. The same realization she had felt the night before. But something still felt wrong. Very wrong. Li Wei remained calm. Too calm. While everyone else panicked, he simply folded his hands and observed. That was when Maya noticed it. His expression. Not fear. Not surprise. Anticipation. As if this chaos was exactly what he expected. Richard slammed the contract onto the table. "This deal is suspended." Several executives nodded immediately. Relief washed across their faces. But Li Wei finally spoke. "I am afraid it is not that simple." Every head turned. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Explain." Richard's voice cracked with anger. Li Wei opened a thin black folder and slid a document across the table. 3 months ago," he said calmly, "your board approved a preliminary authorization package." Richard stared. "That was routine paperwork." "Correct." Li Wei nodded. "And buried inside that paperwork was an acceleration trigger." Maya felt her stomach tighten. "No." Richard grabbed the document and began reading. The room watched him. 30 seconds passed. Then another 30. Nobody moved. Finally his hand started shaking. The paper slipped from his fingers. The attorney nearest him picked it up. His eyes widened immediately. "Richard! Do not!" Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. The attorney looked terrified. "The trigger is already active." Complete silence. Even the city outside seemed to disappear. Maya felt her pulse hammering against her ribs. She understood now. Amendment 14C was never the attack. It was the distraction. The real move had happened months ago. Long before today's signing. Long before anyone started looking. Richard slowly lowered himself into his chair. For the first time since Maya had known him, he looked small. Human. Cornered. Then Li Wei turned toward Maya. You found the wrong trap first, he said softly. Most people would have stopped there. Maya's eyes narrowed. And what did I miss? Li Wei smiled. It was not a victory smile. It was something colder. Something that made several people in the room visibly uncomfortable. Then he reached into his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. On the front was a single name written in black ink. Maya Brooks. The moment she saw it, her blood ran cold. Because she recognized the handwriting. The room stopped breathing. Maya stared at the envelope in Li Wei's hand. The black ink looked unmistakably familiar. Every executive around the table sensed the shift instantly. The merger no longer felt like the center of the crisis. Something else had entered the room. Something personal. Something dangerous. Richard slowly stood again. His chair scraped sharply across the hardwood floor. What is that? He demanded. Li Wei ignored him. His eyes remained fixed on Maya. You recognize it. It was not a question. Maya felt her throat tighten. Her fingertips went cold. She had not seen that handwriting in years. The last time she had seen it, she was standing in a crowded office tower overlooking the Huangpu River. The day everything in her life collapsed. Around the room, phone cameras continued recording. Tiny screens reflected off glass walls and polished metal fixtures. Investors whispered behind raised hands. Nobody understood what was happening anymore. Richard certainly did not. And that terrified him. Answer me, he snapped. His voice echoed harder than intended. The strain was becoming visible now. Sweat darkened the collar of his expensive shirt. The billionaire who controlled boardrooms with a glance suddenly looked like a man watching the floor crack beneath him. Maya swallowed. Where did you get that? Li Wei carefully placed the envelope on the table. It arrived 3 days ago. The room grew quieter. From whom? Maya asked. Li Wei's expression darkened. That is the problem. We do not know. A ripple of unease moved through the attorneys. Richard slammed both palms onto the table. Enough. The sound made several people jump. This company is under attack and everyone is acting like we are in some mystery novel. Nobody answered him. Because deep down, everyone knew he was no longer controlling the conversation. Maya was. And Richard hated it. The realization seemed to hit him all at once. Every warning. Every clause. Every discovery. Every time Maya had been right. While his own legal team missed everything. The humiliation settled visibly across his face. Open it, one investor whispered. Another nodded. Soon several voices joined. Open it. Let us see it. Now. Li Wei pushed the envelope toward Maya. The paper slid across the polished table. The soft scraping sound seemed impossibly loud. Maya hesitated. Her pulse hammered inside her ears. She did not want to touch it. But she already knew she would. Slowly, she reached forward. Her fingers trembled as they brushed the paper. The room watched. Richard watched. Even Li Wei seemed tense for the first time. Maya carefully broke the seal. A single folded document rested inside. Nothing else. No explanation. No signature. Just one page. She unfolded it. The moment her eyes landed on the first line, all color drained from her face. Gasps erupted around the room. Richard stepped forward. What is it? Maya did not answer. Her breathing became shallow. The page shook visibly in her hands. Maya! Richard's voice sounded different now. Less arrogant. More afraid. What does it say? Finally, she looked up. Her eyes were filled with something the room had not seen before. Not confidence. Not fear. Recognition. This cannot be real. The attorneys immediately moved closer. One reached for the paper. Maya handed it over without resistance. 30 seconds later, the attorney looked like he might faint. Another lawyer grabbed the page. Then another. Each reaction was worse than the last. The whispers turned into stunned silence. Richard snatched the document from the nearest attorney. His eyes raced across the page. Then stopped. His face collapsed. Completely. The room watched the billionaire lose every trace of certainty he had left. No. The word barely escaped his lips. Maya closed her eyes. Because the document was not a threat. It was not blackmail. It was not a demand for money. It was something far worse. It was a detailed report proving that someone had been manipulating Sterling Technologies from inside the company for nearly 7 years. And according to the evidence, the person responsible had direct access to every board meeting, every acquisition, every confidential file. Richard's hand shook violently. This is impossible. Maya stared at him. Then at the executives surrounding the table. Then at the faces suddenly avoiding eye contact. Because one detail in the report stood out more than anything else. The person behind everything was in this room right now. And at that exact moment, someone quietly stood up from their chair. The chair legs scraped softly against the hardwood floor. Nobody spoke. Nobody even turned at first. The sound alone was enough. Every eye in the room slowly followed the figure rising from the far end of the conference table. The city skyline shimmered behind the glass walls, muted by gathering clouds. The room felt smaller now. Tighter. Like the air itself had become heavy. Maya watched without moving. Her pulse had slowed. Strangely, the panic was gone. Around her, phone screens remained raised, but nobody seemed interested in recording anymore. They were watching. Waiting. Listening. Richard Sterling stood frozen beside the table, the report still trembling slightly in his hand. His expensive watch caught the cold overhead light. For the first time all morning, he looked older. Not weaker. Just tired. As though years of certainty had suddenly become impossible to trust. The executive who had stood up adjusted his jacket calmly. No rushing. No denial. No panic. That alone made the room even more uncomfortable. Sit down, Richard said. His voice lacked its usual force. The man did not move. A phone vibrated somewhere in the room. The soft buzz sounded unnaturally loud. Then silence returned. Maya noticed something nobody else seemed to notice. The executive was not looking at Richard. He was looking at her. The realization settled heavily in her chest. Not fear. Recognition. The same recognition she had seen earlier in Li Wei's eyes. Across the table, several attorneys exchanged nervous glances. One investor quietly loosened his tie. Another lowered his phone altogether. The room no longer felt like a board meeting. It felt like a courtroom moments before a verdict. Richard took a step forward. Were you involved? No answer. Answer me. The executive finally smiled. Not arrogantly. Almost sadly. You still think this is about me? A chill moved through the room. Maya felt it too. Richard frowned. What does that mean? The man glanced toward the report. Then toward Maya again. You are asking the wrong questions. Nobody spoke. Even the ventilation system seemed quieter now. The executive slowly reached into his suit pocket. Several people stiffened immediately. But he only removed a folded photograph. Old. Slightly worn at the corners. He placed it carefully on the table. Ask her. Every head turned toward Maya. The room's attention hit her like a physical force. Richard looked confused. Angry. Afraid. What is this? Maya stepped closer. The photograph reflected the cold conference lights. For a moment she could not breathe. Because she recognized it instantly. A younger version of herself stood in front of a Shanghai office building. Beside her stood 3 people. One was her former supervisor. One was a compliance director. And the third person made her blood run cold. Li Wei. 20 years younger. Smiling. Standing directly beside her. Gasps rippled across the room. Richard looked from the photo to Maya. Then back again. You know each other? Maya barely heard him. Memories flooded back. Long nights reviewing acquisition structures. Emergency audits. Hidden ownership chains. Cases that disappeared without explanation. And one investigation. One investigation that had ended her entire career. Her hand tightened against the edge of the table. Across the room, Li Wei remained perfectly still. I remember now, Maya whispered. The room leaned in. Even Richard. Remember what? Maya slowly lifted her eyes toward Li Wei. The silence felt endless. You were there. Nobody moved. Li Wei nodded once. Nothing more. Just once. The gesture was enough to send another wave of confusion through the room. Richard looked completely lost now. Somebody tell me what is happening. No one answered. Because Maya was staring at the photograph. And for the first time since entering this building, she was not looking at it with confusion. She was looking at it with certainty. The certainty frightened her. Because the person who destroyed her career 7 years ago was not the executive standing beside the table. It was not Li Wei. And it was not anyone named in the report. Slowly, Maya lifted her eyes toward Richard Sterling. The room followed her gaze. And Richard's face changed the instant he realized where she was looking. Richard Sterling felt every eye in the room swing toward him. The silence was so complete that the faint hum of the building's climate system sounded deafening. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The billionaire who had controlled every conversation that morning now stood trapped inside one. What are you implying? Richard asked. His voice was sharp, but the confidence underneath it was gone. Maya did not answer immediately. The cold conference lights reflected off the glass walls behind her, outlining her silhouette against the Manhattan skyline. For the first time all day, she was not the maid standing beside the room. She was the center of it. 7 years ago, she said quietly, I discovered an acquisition fraud case in Shanghai. Several executives exchanged confused looks. Maya kept her eyes on Richard. The evidence disappeared before regulators could see it. Richard frowned. What does that have to do with me? Maya slowly lifted the photograph. Because the company behind that acquisition had one silent American investor. The room tightened instantly. A lawyer shifted in his seat. An investor lowered his phone. Nobody liked where this was going. Richard laughed once. Short. Forced. That proves nothing. Maya nodded. You are right. The answer caught everyone off guard. Even Richard. She stepped closer to the table. The photograph proves nothing. Then she pointed at the report. But that does. Every eye dropped toward the document. Maya reached for a page near the back. Her movements were calm. Precise. Like someone returning to a language she had not spoken in years. Everyone keeps looking for the person who manipulated Sterling Technologies. She turned another page. Everyone assumes it was one insider. Another page. It was not. The room froze. Richard's face tightened. What are you talking about? Maya slid the report across the table toward the attorneys. Read the transaction timestamps. The senior attorney adjusted his glasses. 30 seconds passed. Then his eyes widened. My God! The words barely escaped him. Suddenly 2 more attorneys leaned in. Then 3. The room erupted into nervous whispers. Richard looked furious. Would somebody explain what is happening? Nobody answered right away. Finally the senior attorney looked up. The manipulation did not start 7 years ago. Richard stared. Then when? The attorney swallowed. It started 11 years ago. Silence. Total silence. Maya could almost hear people's hearts pounding. That is impossible, Richard said. I founded Sterling Technologies 12 years ago. Exactly, Maya replied. The room turned toward her. She continued. Whoever built this scheme was there almost from the beginning. The statement landed like a shockwave. Several investors looked visibly alarmed. One executive slowly sat down as though his legs no longer trusted him. Richard's breathing became heavier. Who? Maya looked at the report one final time. Then she reached into the envelope Li Wei had delivered. Until now, nobody had noticed a second folded sheet hidden inside. Her fingers carefully unfolded it. The paper crackled softly. Every phone camera in the room lifted higher. Every eye locked onto her hands. Richard looked genuinely afraid now. "What is that?" Maya stared at the page. Then something changed. For the first time since entering the room, she looked shocked. Not nervous. Not uncertain. Shocked. Li Wei noticed immediately. So did everyone else. "Maya?" Richard's voice came out barely above a whisper. She did not answer. Her eyes remained fixed on the page. The color drained from her face. Slowly, she lowered the document onto the table. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then she looked directly at Richard. Not with accusation. Not with anger. Something worse. Pity. The room seemed to tilt. Richard took a step backward. "What?" Maya's voice was almost inaudible. "You were never the target." The silence that followed felt endless. Across the room, several executives looked completely lost. Others looked terrified. Richard stared at her, as though he had forgotten how to blink. Then Maya turned the document around so everyone could see the name printed at the very top. The moment the room read it, 3 people stood up at once. And one of them dropped their phone. The phone hit the floor with a sharp crack. Nobody even looked down. Every eye remained fixed on the document lying in the center of the table. The room had gone beyond silence now. It felt suspended. Like time itself had stopped moving. The cold conference lights reflected in wide, stunned eyes. Investors who had spent decades negotiating billion-dollar deals stood motionless. Attorneys who never showed emotion looked shaken. Even the distant hum of the city beyond the glass seemed to fade away. Richard Sterling stared at the name printed on the page. His hand slowly lowered to his side. For the first time all day, nobody was looking at him for answers. They were looking at Maya. The realization hung heavily in the room. Hours earlier she had been the invisible woman carrying coffee. The maid nobody bothered to acknowledge. Now she was the only person who seemed to understand the storm unfolding around them. Maya stood quietly beside the table. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply looked at the document as though it carried the weight of years she had tried to forget. Across the room, Li Wei watched her with something that looked almost like respect. Richard finally spoke. His voice was rough. "How did you know?" Maya lifted her eyes. The question was simple, but everyone knew what he was really asking. How did the woman he dismissed see what his attorneys missed? How did she find what his executives overlooked? How did she become the one person standing between his company and disaster? Maya glanced toward the windows. Rain clouds drifted across the skyline, turning the afternoon light silver. "Because I have seen this before." Nobody interrupted. 7 years ago, people ignored warnings because they came from the wrong person. The words landed softly. Harder than any accusation. Richard looked down. Around him, several executives shifted uncomfortably. They all remembered yesterday. The jokes. The dismissive looks. The assumptions. The room could remember every one of them now. A quiet vibration buzzed from someone's phone. Nobody reached for it. Richard slowly exhaled. "And I did the same thing." Maya said nothing. She did not need to. The silence answered for her. One investor removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Another executive looked away entirely. The atmosphere had changed. Not because Maya had won. Because everyone realized how close they had come to losing everything while ignoring the one voice that mattered. Richard swallowed hard. The confidence that had defined him all morning was gone. In its place stood something unfamiliar. Humility. He looked directly at Maya. Really looked at her. Perhaps for the first time. "When you spoke yesterday." He paused. The words seemed difficult. "I should have listened." The room froze again. Several executives exchanged stunned glances. Nobody had ever heard Richard Sterling admit fault publicly. Not once. Maya's expression softened slightly. Not triumph. Understanding. The contract was never the biggest risk. Richard frowned. What was? Maya looked around the room. At the executives. The attorneys. The investors. Then finally back at Richard. Believing expertise only comes from people who look powerful. Nobody spoke. A few people lowered their eyes. Others nodded almost imperceptibly. The truth settled over the room like a weight. Even the investors recording the meeting slowly lowered their phones. Something deeper than business was happening now. Across the table, Li Wei closed his briefcase. That lesson may have just saved this company. Richard stared at the document again. Then at Maya. Then at the chair she had never been invited to sit in. Without saying a word, he pulled it back from the table. The soft sound echoed through the room. Every head turned. Richard gestured toward the empty seat. Please! The invitation felt larger than the chair itself. Larger than the meeting. Larger than the merger. For several seconds, nobody moved. Maya looked at the chair. Then at Richard. The room waited. The city lights flickered beyond the glass as the first drops of rain touched the windows again. Slowly, Maya stepped forward. But just before she reached the chair, her eyes landed on a final line near the bottom of the document. Her expression changed instantly. Not fear. Not relief. Something far more unsettling. The room noticed immediately. Richard noticed too. What is it? He asked quietly. Maya never looked up from the page. The silence that followed seemed endless. Then she whispered 4 words that drained the remaining color from Li Wei's face. There is another name. The words settled over the room like falling snow. There is another name. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the rain tapping softly against the glass seemed distant now. Maya stood beside the table, the document still in her hands, while dozens of eyes searched her face for answers. The tension that had filled the room all morning had changed. It was no longer fear. It was understanding. Slowly, Maya lifted the final page. The cold overhead lights reflected across the paper. Richard Sterling watched her carefully. Not as a maid. Not as an employee. Not as someone beneath him. As the one person he trusted to tell him the truth. Maya exhaled softly. The second name belongs to a shell company. A few attorneys immediately relaxed. Several investors exchanged relieved looks. Li Wei lowered his eyes and gave the faintest nod. The room seemed to release a breath it had been holding for hours. The hidden network had finally been exposed. The scheme was over. The danger was contained. There was no secret mastermind waiting behind another door. No final betrayal. Just the truth. Plain and quiet. The kind of truth people often miss because they are looking for something louder. Richard sank slowly into his chair. The leather creaked beneath him. For several seconds he simply stared at the tabletop. The billionaire who had walked into the room certain he controlled everything now sat surrounded by the evidence of how wrong he had been. Not because he lacked intelligence. Because he had stopped listening. Across the room, phones gradually lowered. Cameras stopped recording. Nobody wanted a viral moment anymore. They had witnessed something better. Something real. Richard finally looked up. His eyes found Maya. You saved this company. The statement hung in the air. Maya shook her head gently. No. Richard frowned. No? The truth saved the company. The answer was simple. Honest. Exactly the kind of answer nobody else in the room would have given. A faint smile appeared on Li Wei's face. Several investors nodded quietly. Richard looked down again. This time, there was no defense left in him. No pride. No excuses. Just reflection. He remembered the jokes in Mandarin. The laughter. The assumptions. The way he had looked straight through the woman standing only a few feet away. The memory seemed heavier now than any financial loss could have been. After a long silence, he stood. The room immediately turned toward him. Richard stepped around the table and stopped in front of Maya. Nobody had ever seen him do this before. Not investors. Not attorneys. Not executives. "I was wrong." The words were quiet. Yet somehow they filled the entire room. Maya met his gaze. Richard swallowed hard. "About you." Another silence followed. Different this time. Softer. Human. Maya nodded once. Not because she needed the apology, but because she understood what it cost him to say it. The tension finally began to dissolve. Outside, the clouds were breaking apart. Thin strands of afternoon sunlight slipped between the buildings and washed across the conference room windows. The silver reflections on the table warmed into gold. One by one, people began gathering documents, closing laptops, exchanging quieter conversations. The storm was ending. Yet nobody seemed eager to leave. They all felt it. The strange weight of a moment they would remember for years. Richard glanced toward the chair he had offered Maya earlier, then toward the empty seat beside him at the table. Without saying a word, he pulled it out. Not as an invitation. As recognition. Maya looked at the chair for a moment. Then she smiled faintly and sat down. Around the room, no one seemed surprised anymore. It simply felt right. Minutes later, as the meeting finally dissolved, Maya stepped toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. The city stretched endlessly beneath the fading rain. Glass towers shimmered in the late afternoon light. Behind her, the room continued moving. Papers shuffled. Doors opened and closed. Quiet voices drifted through the air. But for a moment she heard none of it. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass. Not the Maid people thought they knew. Not the analyst she used to be. Just herself. Strong. Steady. Unbroken. A few feet behind her, Richard paused before leaving. He looked toward the woman he had once dismissed without a second thought. Then he quietly removed the visitor badge hanging from the back of her chair and placed it on the empty conference table. No speeches. No announcement. No audience. Just a small piece of plastic catching the last ray of sunlight before the room fell silent. And somehow, that said everything.